Okay, I'm joined by the Athletic senior football news writer Matt Slater, who broke the news that Premier League clubs are keen on a hard spending limit, basically a salary cap tied to the income of the lowest earning side in the top flight. Matt, there is a shout out to all the subscribers on the Athletic for questions about the new financial rules, so we thought we'd throw a few of those to you today. Now, before we get into the questions, Matt, quickly, just bring us up to speed as to what was discussed at Monday's Premier League shareholders meeting.
Yeah, sure. Anchoring. It's going to be it's a new term, right? It's going to slip into the lexicon of phrases that football fans need to have a grasp of. Right behind amortization. I'm not sure what comes after anchoring. I haven't thought this one through enough. So the idea, think of it as a backstop. So it's to work in tandem with the squad cost rules, which I think we've discussed on an earlier podcast. And these are the UEFA-style rules that are replacing. They've already replaced for UEFA financial fair play. And that's a soft salary cap because that ties a club's ability to spend on what they themselves earn, right? And we've had a version of that in the Premier League for about a decade, called profitability and sustainability, which I know we've talked about on the podcast many times over the last few months. And look, as a principle, it's sort of we eat what we kill, right? It's a percentage of what you earn. Now, anchoring is a harder cap because there's actually going to be a number that is sort of a defined number, a proper ceiling. And what's interesting about it is it's capping what a big club, a really ambitious club, a top earner can spend on somebody else's ability to spend. So let me explain. As it has been proposed, it is a top to bottom cost control, with the top club only being able to spend on their squad, so first team players' wages and coaches' wages, your transfer fees, which are amortized, that's an annual cost, so that's the transfer fees spread over the length of a player's contract, and any agent's payments you make. So that's your squad cost. That will be capped on a 5 times multiple of what the lowest earning club gets from central Premier League revenues. So that is the amount of money that the Premier League shares with all clubs from broadcast revenues and those central sponsorships. So those are your central Premier League revenues. And if we look at 2022-23, the bottom club that year was Southampton, and they got £103.6 million from the Premier League's domestic and international rights and those sponsorship deals. So there's your bottom club. If you multiply that by 5, you get to £518 million. Now, is that generous? Is that tight? Is that loose? Well, when we estimated that season's squad costs, only Chelsea, and we know how much Chelsea spent both on players and wages, would have breached it. Now, I think they spent, in our estimate, about 536, something like that. So they were a little bit over. Now, actually, since doing those estimates, I actually now think that Chelsea probably wouldn't have breached either. Because in my guesstimate, I was using about 72% of their total wage bill, because clubs don't reveal how much they spend on their players. They only do a total wage bill for the entire club. So I applied a sort of rule of thumb of 72.5% to the total wage bill, which I'm pretty relaxed about. But I think overcharged them for agents' fees, because when I've looked harder at squad cost and what UEFA are doing, only about half of what clubs pay to agents will go into the squad cost calculation. Now, it's really technical, this, and it's just to do with the work that agents do. Some of it is for clubs, and that is a one-off cost for acquiring an asset, and that's accounted for in the books by depreciation. It's a one-off cost. I know I'm losing people here. This is pure accounting. and the other half is the service they do to the player. Now that is expensed through the profit and loss account, and that's amortized. So forget most of the last two sentences. The key bit is only about half of what clubs pay to agents, I think, goes into the squad cost calculation. I take half of Chelsea's agents' fees off for that year, and it actually brings them under 518. So the bit to really hear, if you like, is that if we look at a 5 times multiple of the bottom club's central Premier League earnings in 22-23, I don't think any of them breached it. So it's not a particularly tight cap. So therefore, why bother? Well, I think that's where it gets into really interesting stuff. And I know lots of the readers have sent in questions along those lines. So that, I don't want to say too much in the opening preamble, but that's what they're talking about. When it was first mooted a year or so ago by the likes of Steve Parish at Crystal Palace, he was, I think, thinking of perhaps a tighter cap, 4.5 times. You can see why the Premier League doesn't want to make it too restrictive. Obviously invites legal challenges. It might even genuinely constrain the Premier League. We don't want that to, we don't want to do that. But it is a backstop. It is a ceiling that I think stops, certainly for people like Parish and Crystal Palace and clubs around him, it stops the big clubs galloping off into the distance.
How many clubs voted for it, and did any actually vote against it? Well,
I think that's a really good question. I think we have to sort of caveat what we're saying here about vote for it. What the vote on Monday was about going to the next stage of the debate, if you like. Sure. It was basically saying, the Premier League saying, look, guys, here's this idea. We've sent you some papers on it. You might have read about it. I know you've been chatting about it. Do you give us permission to keep working on it? So actually sort of get into the detail, the legal detail. And I think really importantly, consult properly with the Professional Footballers Association, right? Because they're going to be key to this. It is a salary cap, and the Players' Union, for totally understandable reasons, doesn't like salary caps. You or I wouldn't like it either in our industry. So that was what the vote was about. Should we progress this? Should we keep talking about this? And the vote was 16-3-1, if you like. They needed 40, and they did 2/3 to yes, 2/3 majority, keep going. They got 16. The 3 clubs that voted against were Manchester City, Manchester United, and Aston Villa, and Chelsea, who I've already referred to, abstained.
Okay, fascinating. Just out of curiosity, when is it looking, if it does make it over the line, when is it looking to be moved, to come into place, I should say?
Well, I suspect it will be exactly like the proposed move to squad cost, which I know we've discussed. So the Premier League is moving in the same direction as UEFA. So it is moving away from the profitability and sustainability rules that we've had over the last decade or so, where clubs are, if you like, allowed to lose a certain amount of money over a rolling 3-year period, that number being 105 million. And that number also excluding lots of losses, losses for things like money they spend on new stadiums and training grounds, community projects, youth development, the women's team, etc. They're moving away from that to this UEFA model, which started a year or so ago, and UEFA is phasing in over 3 years with the goal of 25-26 being 70%. So 70% of what you earn, all of your earnings, including player trading, 70% of that you can spend on your first team squad. That's where Premier League is going as well. Again, with the Premier League, there's always a little caveat. It's going to be 70% for your big clubs that play in Europe, because they are going to have to. If they want to play in Europe, they're going to have to meet UEFA's rules. But for clubs not in Europe, it can be 85%. Now, why? Weird? Well, it's actually, if you think about it, pretty much the same two-tier approach that the Premier League has had for the last decade, whereas clubs in Europe have only been allowed to lose 30 million euros over a rolling 3-year period, because that's what UEFA is demanding. But Premier League clubs have been allowed to lose more, 105 million, 35 million quid over a year, if you like. And the idea there being, if you limit all clubs to 70% of their revenues, well, it's going to be really hard for any non-UEFA club, any sort of middle class, any promoted club to compete. So you almost have to let them spend a bit more. to speculate a bit more, to just push the envelope a little bit more. So that's why they can go up to 85%. So that's coming in, and that's going to be phased in next year. They're going to have it sort of as a shadow idea next year. So profitability and sustainability remains next year, with squad costs sort of operating in the background, and it will come into force in 25-26. I suspect anchoring, if it is approved, I think it's a big if at this point, will come in 25-26 as well. And the way to think about it is it's meant to be complementary. So squad cost is the sort of main thing. That's what we want you all to be working towards. And this anchoring is your backstop. It is to sort of give, if you like, the likes of Crystal Palace, West Ham, Bournemouth, Brighton, all those sort of middle sort of tier clubs, and all the promoted clubs as well, and anyone who's trying to compete with Manchester City, so clubs like Liverpool and Arsenal. It's to give them the comfort that they want, to sort of stop the arms race for player wages, to sort of provide to put a brake on that, to restrain, frankly, Manchester City a little bit, and probably Newcastle in time, and to provide, well, I think what people like Crystal Palace are really concerned about is just the competitive balance of the league. And if we don't do something, if we don't put a hard line in, clubs like Manchester City, I'm not going to pick on them, but clearly Manchester United voted against it as well. Chelsea probably would have voted against it if they thought there was any chance of it not going through. And of course Villa, so that's interesting. We'll get into that in a minute. It's to stop those clubs that get to play in Europe, that get to see their commercial revenue go up and up and up and up, that may well play in a FIFA Club World Cup, which is going to be very lucrative. If they are just tied to a multiple of their revenue, of their own revenue, well, look, how can we compete? We can barely compete now. In 5 years, 10 years, that train will have left the station. So that's what this is about.
Okay, well, I tell you what, you probably end up semi-repeating yourself through this question and answer session, but I actually think the questions are really good just to get to the specifics of it as well. So let's get into those questions. We've got one here from Tom N, who says, in reality, how punitive are these rules on the richer clubs? Circa £500 million limit on spending is hardly forcing teams to scratch around the bargain bin, is it?
I think Tom gets it. So I think the answer there, he's answered his own question really, is at the moment, not very punitive at all. I've already talked about the estimates that we did, and we thought it was only Chelsea really that would have breached in 22-23. And I've already explained that I'm actually no longer certain of that guesstimate. So it's the number's been pitched there for a reason, right? They haven't gone for 4.5, as Parish was discussing about a year ago, and were people we were talking about a few months ago. I picked up on this a couple of months ago. They've gone for 5. And it is sort of meant to be just sort of out of reach, right? It's like, come on, guys, don't panic. None of you have breached it yet, and it is supposed to be a bit. Well, some will think of it as a stretch target. Others will think of it as a backstop. That you really shouldn't have to spend that much. You are all very good. You'll have some of the biggest squad costs in the world. Your wage bills are right up there. You don't need to spend that much. Now, that's the sort of message. Don't panic the horses a little bit. I think the point of your opponents is, but why do this at all? Why peg us to somebody else's ability to earn? Man United have sort of they've actually gone on the record, if you like. I mean, not sort of really on the record, but they have sort of they've been more relaxed than the others about talking about this privately anyway. They're like, well, we're a big club, right? We've been a big club for a very long time, and the revenues we earn are because of that. They're because we've been big for 3-4 generations, and our commercial revenues are a result of that. We have an amazing shirt deal, and we have all these sponsors, and we've got a big stadium and blah, blah, blah. It's because we're Man United. And who are you, who's anyone else, to tell us how much we think we can afford to pay people? And that, I think, is just a basic, very basic principle of sort of salary caps and why they are problematic, and why anyone coming along to any industry and saying we're going to limit how much you can pay people, really, what, why, and what if my company can afford it and actually wants to pay me more? Explain to me why they can't. So these are good questions, and it's a good debate to have. So I think Tom is right. Not very punitive at the moment. Could it be punitive in time? I think punitive is probably the wrong word, but could it be a limiting or restraining factor? Yeah, yes, I think it could. So that's the debate.
Right, Donovan H says, and actually I think this is really interesting. Most of the major pro sports in the US have salary or spending caps. How do the proposed rules for the English Premier League relate? I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because yes, I've seen a model in America, which means, if you overspend, for instance, you can see it trickling down to, other teams and stuff like that. What about this in particular for the Premier League?
Well, this is where we get right into it. So, it's not just the likes of Crystal Palace who are concerned about, can we keep up? And by the way, Crystal Palace have US owners. It is, I think, this is another sign of the growing influence of North American ownership on our game.
Interesting.
Now, some people will go, oh, God, straight away, like all-star games and halls of fame and all, cheerleaders, but also cost controls and an expectation that owning a sports team is not just a charity. It's not just for showing off. It's not for laundering money or your reputation or whatever other reasons people might want to throw out there. It's a business, and businesses shouldn't lose money. And therefore sensible cost controls are not unreasonable. So, have that in mind. And then think about the North American sports model, which is, and I think I've sort of said this 100 times on different podcasts and in pieces over the years, very interesting, very good, and works in North America. Okay? And it's something that you can't do a little bit of, you wholeheartedly do it, right? And that means for it to work, it kind of only works really in closed leagues, right? So if you forget promotion and relegation, it only really works if you genuinely share the revenues. So the jeopardy you create, that you lose by not having promotion and relegation, and so that you lose jeopardy there with sort of genuine contests at the top and the bottom, and mini races for Europe and all that. So you create that jeopardy by this. Any team can have a chance, right? And you have playoffs, but you don't just have teams that are perpetually doomed to be rubbish. And you do that by sharing the revenue. So genuine sharing. And you do it so the big teams in New York and LA and Chicago don't win every time. Smaller market teams can win. And you do it also by sharing the talent. This is the bit that people often forget. The draft system is a way of sharing the talent evenly around. The bad shall pick first. You shouldn't be bad forever unless you're really rubbish at picking. So this is those two bits go hand in hand. Or three bits, really. No relegation, so calm down, everybody. You're not going to get booted out. So there's the ultimate business jeopardy goes. Share everything, share the money, and share the talent. Right? You do all that, you have a compelling product that works in that setting. But that's not what we have in Europe. Yeah. And do you know what? Our system works really well too. It's great. It's been around for 100 plus years, and we love it. And as has been proven, increasing amounts of North Americans love it too.
Yeah.
Now, they're both good. But what's really hard is when you start picking bits. So could, for example, and this is one of the big debates in North American soccer, should we just take promotion and relegation? Because that's really good. Well, it is good, but it's going to be really, really hard for your owners and your franchises when their business model just falls apart overnight because they've been relegated. Have you thought about the mechanism and what you do there and how they come back, and what's your second tier like? Do you have parachute payments? Oh my God, don't do that. But do you have, that sort of thing, right? What do you do? And then we'll go, oh yeah, but we really like cost controls and salary caps. Okay, but do you share talent? Are you willing to? What are we going to do about cross-border, competition? The NFL doesn't have to play the German league in a Champions League, or the Japanese league in a Champions League, or they could try, but what's the point? They'd win. It wouldn't be much of a contest. It's a genuine contest when the best of the Premier League play the best of Spain and the best of Germany and the best. You can see the myriad issues it throws up. So this endless balance between, there's this North American sports model that works really well, and there's this European sports model that appears to work really well for football. And do we take bits? Is it like a menu? No, it's not. It's sort of it's kind of you go all in. So that is this issue, and this is just the latest sort of flashpoint, the latest talking point that I find myself kind of looking at, and it's been the last sort of 10, 20 year story, and I think it's going to be the next story for going forward as well. How you marry the two systems together. Can you?
Yeah, it's tough though, taking a model from a different culture and trying to apply it to another culture without understanding the nuances that surround that in essence. But I mean, it's just ideas at this moment in time, but I like that question. Let's move on to a Simon W, who says, actually, and this is about raising revenue. Does this mean we all need to start buying Brentford shirts to boost their revenue so that our teams can spend a little bit more?
Right. Well, I can do this one quicker. So yeah, by all means, keep doing that for your squad cost, for the main, I think, cost control that we're moving towards, the main sort of iteration of financial fair play we're moving towards, where the more Brentford can earn, the more any of these clubs can earn, the better, right? The more sustainable the club will be, the more they can put on the pitch. For this particular rule, and this is why it is so interesting, no, it doesn't really make any difference, because it is the whole point, the anchoring, the linkage is with the central Premier League revenues. So that, I might get into this on another question later, that is why this appeals to the likes of, dare I say, Liverpool, Spurs, Arsenal, because they are particularly concerned about Manchester City's ever increasing commercial revenues, and no doubt Newcastle in time to come, which frankly they don't believe. They've never believed. And they still don't believe. Right? It's the suspension of belief is becoming less important, I guess, is it less of a stretch because Man City are now a genuinely established club. It's very hard to say that someone that wins the treble, your shirt deal is way too big, or your the sponsors that you have to the club are ridiculous. None of those make sense anymore, because Man City have been good for 10 years. And their fan base is growing all the time. However, what Liverpool and Arsenal and those sorts of clubs that worry about the likes of Man City will keep saying is, yeah, but it's always the top end of the benchmarking, always. And their main sponsors are still related parties from the countries where their owners come from. And we're going over old ground here, So we just frankly don't believe those numbers. They're always going to be pushing the envelope on those numbers, tying Manchester City and Newcastle and whoever else is next to transparent numbers that cannot be manipulated, gamed, stretched, whatever, is a restraint on them. So that's again part of what's going on there.
Okay. Well, the next one speaks about the UEFA rules actually, and I think Ben H has a really interesting point. He says, how would the new regulations tie in with the UEFA rules? Could you conceivably have a situation where a team spends 500 to 600 million and wins the Premier League competing fairly, but it's not allowed entry to European competitions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's unlikely, because for a team to win the Premier League, spend a lot of money winning the Premier League, they've still got to sort of satisfy Premier League rules. They've still got to satisfy, even if let's say they're not one of those current clubs in Europe, so they've still got that 85% number to worry about. If by winning the Premier League, well, one, they're going to have done they're going to have a good season. I imagine their stadium's going to be full. They're going to sell loads of shirts, but crucially, they're going to earn lots of Premier League central income. They're going to get a big merit payments. So at the moment, if we look at 22-23, the most recent numbers, Manchester City earned 170 million from the Premier League. Right, that was their flat share plus, the extra amounts they get in merit payments, and for being on TV a lot. So you start to put that in on the credit side. Winning the Premier League, of course, also qualifies you for the Champions League, right? So the Champions League is a sort of, even if you're rubbish in the Champions League the following year, 45 million. So I know it's a good hypothetical, but I just think that by winning the Premier League, that you're going to do pretty well in the balance sheet as well, your profit loss as well. So a really good example of that is Leicester. The year after they won the Premier League, I think it was a record profit. It was they did really, really well, and I think even the following year they did well as well too. It was unfortunately their inability to remain in the Champions League whilst spending big on wages that did for them. So that's the thing. And then the other thing is, okay, even if we factor all that in, and they're still over either the UEFA limit and the Premier League limit. What do UEFA tend to do in those cases? Well, UEFA tend to go for quick justice. They don't hang about, but they tend to go for fines and or measures short of bans. So things like, and I ask everyone to cast their minds back to the first set of cases, the Man City and PSG cases, where it was fines and it was also limits on their squads for European competition. Now, since then, there have been dozens of cases involving, clubs big and small. Most of them, fans wouldn't have noticed, apart from fans of those particular clubs, often in Eastern or Central Europe, where they're fined a small amount, which nearly is always money that is just taken off the money they're going to receive from UEFA, and it will be a squad limitation, squad restriction. PSG, I think, have been through a couple of these, and it's the fines. Juve, I think, are currently sitting out Europe. AC Milan have been through that as well, where they sort of almost take a year's ban, but they were going to miss it anyway. Those have been the most serious cases. And of course, the big one was when UEFA thought that City really, really had cheated. And that, of course, went to CAS, and City won, and their proposed ban was overturned. But I'd say 95 times out of 100, UEFA's approach is a fine.
Okay, well, I'm probably going to put these two together, really. This one from Andrew R. and also Daniel. Let's start with Andrew R's first. Who will they benefit the most and the least, which is the question. The clubs who voted against the changes make it difficult to tell, as they're the clubs that are in very different positions to one another. And then Daniel O goes on to say, how much will it benefit the likes of Liverpool and their supposed Moneyball approach with Michael Edwards at the helm?
So I like those, and I particularly like the middle one, because I think they've sort of spotted what's really going on here, and the motivations of people in the game.
That's a really good question.
And self-interest. Self-interest. The whole game is riven with self-interest. So, why did Man United vote against this? I think I can almost sort of boil this question down to, why did Man United vote against this? Because ordinarily, Manchester United would support something like this, or certainly would support cost controls. They have been big backers in the past of financial fair play, going right back sort of 10, 11, 13 years ago. And they've certainly had no issue with the Premier League's PSR regime. And if you think about it, that makes complete sense, because one, Manchester United are big. They're a big established club. So anything that kind of ties you to how much you can earn kind of plays in their favour, it plays to their strengths. And second, of course, they've been owned by Americans who are very comfortable with this regime. They own an NFL team. And three, they're not unusual about that. The other Americans own sport that have Premier League teams also own North American teams. The Glazers have been paying themselves dividends. All right, that is unusual. So they actually quite like their club to be profitable. However, there's a new sheriff in town. They are increasingly the de facto boss at Manchester United, and it's Ineos. And I think they have spotted that this is a bit of a restraint. It's like, hold on a minute, we've got to do a quick turnaround here. We're going to do some serious surgery to Man United. We need to spend. We want to crack on. Let's not take 2 years to do this. 4 windows. Can we do it in 2? Can we do it in 1? I don't know. I don't know. Who knows how bad the situation is? How bad they think the situation is? But we know they want to get on with it. So they see this as a break on their turnaround operation at Man United. So that's interesting. So you have a club that traditionally would have been like, oh God, we want to restrain Man City, and we quite like cost controls that play to our strengths, thinking almost tactically, more short term, no, we don't like this. Aston Villa, I think, is another interesting opponent. And I think that just shows how ambitious they are.
That was what I was thinking. Considering they are right now fourth or third.
That is an expression of ambition. And Manchester and their owners are very, very rich. I think it's almost they're kind of like they've gone under the radar a little bit. Villa, Wes Edens and Nassef Sahiris are multi-billionaires who own the Milwaukee Bucks, and I can't remember the other teams they own, but they're very successful. They want to get on with it. I think they sense their moment. And they are a little bit constrained by Villa Park and the fact that they are sort of, they're on a rapid, if you like, relatively rapid, because it wasn't that long ago they were in the second tier. It wasn't that long ago they were owned by a disastrous Chinese regime that almost crashed the entire club. So they're on, they've got the wind in the sails, and they want to press on. Man City we've already discussed. They sort of just feel like, oh God, you lot are just picking on us, and anything you can do to hold us back, we're not having it. The rest of them, so then you can think, look, what's in it for Liverpool and Arsenal? Well, that's, I think, obvious, and Spurs and those sorts of clubs. Anything that we can do just to sort of peg Man City back a little bit and keep an eye on Newcastle. They're coming up on the rails. Crystal Palace, I've already sort of discussed what's in it for them, and any promoted club, and anyone that's sort of worried about living in the land of giants and having to compete with clubs that get to play in UEFA, get to play in European competitions. Don't forget, the Champions League is expanding, right? And there's more money coming down the pipeline for those guys. And there is a Club World Cup that's going to be about to start. And if you're lucky enough, if you're one of the sort of 2 Premier League teams that's going to be in that, wow, there's another nice little side hustle. And then of course just all the added eyeballs that all that stuff brings. So that's just more commercial revenue, and everyone's growing their stadiums. God, it's tough. It's a nightmare. It's I don't blame them for thinking, God, can we have a more restrictive cost control, please? Because this is getting difficult. So those are your winners and losers.
Right. Well, Jack V asks, it seems that the Premier League has been searching for the right balance of financial rules for the past decade plus that allow clubs to be ambitious while preventing another Portsmouth, for instance. Is this the right balance?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
It's probably not for you to say.
It doesn't feel like that is one for me. I mean, I often try to point out that I'm not a pundit. I'm not a columnist. I don't sound off. This is not. I don't want to start naming some of these people, but I'm not a former owner of a club that has loads of opinions on how to run clubs. I'm a reporter, right? So I sort of find stuff out, and I try and work out what it's all about, and I try and tell you a lot about it and set it into context. So all I can do is explain the idea, why people like it, why people dislike it, where it's come from, possible next steps, the obvious obstacles I can see to it, but also the benefits. And I suppose one thing that I probably should have said earlier, and I think it does sort of semi-answer this question about this sort of balance, is whilst a lot of clubs are doing this purely for sort of self-interested reasons, and it's because they don't like that lot over there, underpinning it, and I think there is a sort of sincere belief here, is that why is the Premier League being successful? What is it about the Premier League? Because it wasn't always successful. It wasn't always the number one domestic sort of football league. I'm old enough to remember that. And what is it the Premier League's got right? Well, most people would say what it's got right, and it's had various advantages, English language, it's, you know, where it sits in the world in terms of time zones and, you know, the history, the brands. It's definitely had advantages. But one thing it's crucially got right is that the perception sometimes is that it's a really competitive league. And it is definitely true, measurably true, that it is more, it's better at sharing its wealth than the other big European leagues. It's not quite NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB levels of sharing, but it is better than all the other big leagues. So the ratio, the merit-based ratio is tighter and smaller than it is elsewhere. You know, and that has enabled clubs at the bottom to invest in their squads and to buy better players. And that has lifted the value, the quality of the entire product, and that has been good for everyone. So there is a perception that our league is deeper than any others. And I suppose you can sort of say the fact that we have a big six as opposed to a big two or a big three is evidence of that. And it might now be a big seven, might be a big eight, right? That we have more. It's not a 2-horse race, 3-horse race. So that has been the Premier League's strength. It's been its USP. So anything that threatens that threatens everything, and anything that bolsters that should continue to help the league grow. So that I think is that balance point, that just letting the big clubs spend whatever the hell they want could lead us, and again, some people would say, are we not there already, to a 1-horse, 2-horse race, 3-horse race.
Yeah.
When we don't want that. Even if it's just a perception, we don't want that.
Okay. Well, let's move on finally to, I guess, how this might affect transfers. And Dara N says, will players not just go elsewhere where there are no salary caps? I mean, in fairness, the Premier League does pay pretty well at this moment in time, you know?
Well, look, I think this is a good question because it is going to be a widely asked question, and it is going to be something that's thrown up. I think it's nonsense, I'm afraid. Yeah. But I think it's understandable nonsense, and I'll explain why. One, as you've already noted, the Premier League pays huge wages. Right? I think UEFA did a report. They looked at the 2023 numbers, top 20 wage bills in European football, therefore global football. 10 of the 20 were Premier League clubs. No other league had more than 3 clubs in the top 20. The average wage is massive in the Premier League. On transfer spending, the lead is even bigger. The English market is the only one that really reopened properly after the pandemic. So if you start looking at squad costs and the amount they spend on agents, the Premier League is streets ahead. And it's streets ahead because its revenues are the biggest by a long way. And in fact, that's probably stretching because most of the other leagues are currently struggling to get their domestic deals away, you know, even to sort of get the same amount. Some of them are starting to see reductions. The Premier League is not really growing domestically, but it is still growing internationally, and that's been the if you like the real success story of the Premier League. So let's just remember that the Premier League, this doesn't hurt that. It doesn't, not really. And the Premier League has this big lead already. And just because it didn't do very well in Europe this year, geez, come on, you know. Are we really blaming that? You know, things happen, right? You can't win every year.
There are cycles continuously in football.
Well, right? And this is a mini cycle. It's not even a real cycle. You know, I know that we haven't got the 5th place because that's based on 1 year's coefficient. But if you look at the actual, you know, older coefficient, which goes on 5 years, 10 years performance, the Premier League is still the number 1 league.
Still up there.
Yeah, of course it is. So, you know, do not let just 1 year's set of results throw all the data out the window. And then I think we start to sort of get to, if we really sort of think about this, where would they go? Okay, sure, there are some big clubs that still have big wage bills. Barca has a massive wage bill. I think it has the biggest, PSG. But PSG are trying to trim their wage bill. They're trying to move to a sustainable model. Barca are desperately trying to trim their wage bill to avoid bankruptcy. So, you know, they can only field 11 players anyway. So, you know, I don't see where this obvious avenue, these other clubs that aren't affected by salary cap. I don't see it. England is actually quite a nice place to live and work if you're wealthy. It's a really nice place to play football if you're a wealthy footballer. They appear to like it, and I don't blame them. So then you start thinking, well, okay, sort of, I don't, maybe not a short-term, medium threat then, but what's a longer-term threat? Is it Saudi? Maybe, but at the moment, there's no evidence that lock, stock, and barrel people are moving over there. It's a couple players at the end of their careers. It tends to be Muslim players that have an affinity with that part of the world. I don't, I think we're very much in sort of kind of, how's that going? I want to see a little bit more evidence before I sort of, make any sort of firm predictions about the Saudi Pro League. I'd say there's just as much chance of the Saudi Pro League being the Chinese Super League as there is of it being a genuine top 5, top 10 sort of league. Arguably I'd say MLS is probably more of a long-term threat. But then, as we've already discussed, North American sports owners love cost controls. They like profitability. So I do not see how this very loose, generous, let's not be too restrictive cap is going to change that anytime soon. The Premier League has enormous leads financially. There are no obvious clouds on the horizon, and I don't think this changes the landscape. I just don't.
Well, I think we should end it there, Matt. Just very, very quickly, just to round it all off, really, just so people have it in their heads and sort of lamented there. When is this looking to be put into force if all goes through?
Well, that's good because I can just re-emphasise something that I think is really important, and that's the PFA's role in this. So, like I think I sort of said, I see it as complementary to the move away from profitability and sustainability and towards UEFA style, whatever the Premier League call it in the end, cost control, something like that, right? So we're moving towards that for the season 25-26. If this goes through, it will be a backstop to that. The two will work together. So 25-26. However, right, next steps. Having been given the green light to carry on working on this, to get through the detail, they are absolutely going to have to properly consult the PFA. Now, the PFA know about this. There have been some preliminary conversations. Now, the body that you do that in is called the Professional Football Negotiating and Consultative Committee. Bit of a mouthful, nearly always ignored, but it is the body that the FA, the two leagues, EFL, Premier League and PFA sit on to decide all matters to do with employment, so contracts. Now, its work, if nothing's happening, you'd never even know this committee exists. But this is absolutely bread and butter. This is a salary cap. This is absolutely where that goes. Now, the last time we heard about them, I don't know if anyone will remember, was during the pandemic, the EFL, in response to alarm from their clubs, tried to bring in a soft salary cap in the Championship. Now, one already exists in League One and League Two, and it's, without getting too technical, again, it's a percentage of how much you earn. They sort of said, well, let's bring this in because we're really worried about clubs in the Championship. But they didn't properly consult the PFA. They did not go through all the hoops at the committee. And the PFA said no. And the EFL, faced with the prospect of when there's a disagreement there, you go to independent arbitration, and we've had a lot of that recently, haven't we? The PFA, the EFL just backed down. So I suspect there will be rounds of meetings at that committee. The PFA, I think, will have to block this, because it is a hard cap, and as a point of principle, I think they almost have to. They have to. I just don't think they'd be sort of serving their members otherwise, unless it's multiple of 6. It's so irrelevant, so pointless that it's just it doesn't matter. I think they have to block it, and then we go to arbitration. Then it becomes a dispute that a third party is going to have to resolve, and the arguments that the league will have to make are the same arguments that have been aired around financial fair play when people have challenged it. Agents have challenged it. I think some clubs have challenged it. And that's always been as an EU law issue. And again, it's about restraint of trade and anti-competition and all that. But the basic principle is, all right, we absolutely admit that the salary caps are a restraint of trade. But we're doing it for good reason. The ends justify the means. We're doing it because football is a cherished, loved, culturally important industry, and we're worried about the sustainability of our clubs. And it's fair and proportionate for those, this measure, which we agree is probably against the law, is justifiable and therefore legal because it's proportionate. It's not too restrictive. It's not too harmful. So you've got to be careful, right? You can't push it too far. So that is where I think this goes. And how long that will take, who knows? And whether they can make that argument, who knows?
Yeah, Matt, honestly, thanks so much for your time. We've covered one hell of a lot of information on this, and I hope the listeners really appreciated that, as well as the people that sent in questions. Really good to have your questions in as well. Thank you so much for listening. We're back tomorrow. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcast from.